Hi everyone, welcome to this episode of Keipert Labs. In today's video we're going to be taking a look at the neuron, the basic building block of the nervous system. We're going to look at how it's a specialized cell. We'll have a look at the different parts of the neuron and how neurons connect together to send signals throughout the nervous system. So we're going to remind ourselves of the different parts of the nervous system. We're then going to take a close look at the parts of the neuron, specifically focusing on one part called the axon, and its particular structure and how that enables your nervous system to send signals. We're then going to look at how a signal is able to travel through a nerve cell or a neuron from point A to point B. We're going to look at how neurons connect together, which involves talking about a thing called the synapse, which is the connection between two neurons, and then also talking about the chemical messengers we call neurotransmitters. Okay, so here is a simplified diagram of the nervous system. We've seen this diagram before in a previous video. It's showing how the nervous system is responsible for coordination. So making sure that the different systems are working together and complementing each other to achieve a common goal of keeping you alive from 1 minute to the next and then from one day, 1 year to the next. Okay, so it's the aspect of coordination that's responsible for fast control. We'll see in the future that the endocrine system is responsible for slow control. And so it consists of two parts called the central nervous system, which is your brain, and then the spinal cord running down through the middle of your spinal column, and then your peripheral nervous system, which is all the nerves that extend out from that to the rest of your body. Okay, and so then these nerves, or the cells that make up the peripheral nervous system in particular, is where we're going to focus now. So this is the general structure of the specialized cell we call a neuron. Okay, and so it's got kind of four main parts that I want to draw your attention to. The first one is the cell body. Now, not all neurons look the same. This is what we would call a motor neuron. So a neuron that's responsible for making movement happen or making an action happen. So it has a cell body up here with the nucleus contained inside. Extending out from the cell body, we have these things called dendrites, which come from the Greek word for branches, as you can understand, because it kind of looks like the branches of a dead, a tree that's lost its leaves. That the idea is that these connect into the surrounding tissue or connect to surrounding neurons for signals to feed in. We then have this long kind of connection between here called the axon, and we're going to take a closer look at that in a second. And then down at the end here we have what we call axon terminals or axon branches, depending on who you ask. So that they form the end of the neuron and they can connect onto other things. So that might be connecting onto a muscle or a gland, it might be connecting onto another neuron or series of neurons. Or it might, so there's lots of places that might be heading to. Okay, so the axon. So it's this middle kind of tube-like section that makes up most of the length of a neuron. Now the axon itself can be, anywhere up to like 1 meter in length for a given cell. Many would be shorter than that, but the idea being that this is a particularly long kind of connection. Now, so the idea is that the axon is where, so the signal travels from the cell body. So the neuron picks up signals from somewhere or something else, and then the signal gets transmitted along the axon all the way down to our terminals or our axon branches at the end. But the idea is that the faster that, in order for this signal to travel really quickly through your body, that we need to make sure that that the signal can travel very quickly through this cell. And also we need to make sure that this connection, because it's so long and is therefore quite vulnerable, that it can be protected. Because if that were to be damaged or to break, then that neuron stops functioning. And so whatever the signal that it's trying to send is blocked. It's like making sure that one lane of the highway, a large highway, is able to stay open at all times, because otherwise, if it gets blocked, then it might prevent traffic from going a particular way. And so what happens, so there's kind of two parts of this that I want to draw your attention to. The first one is how it's able to be protected. We have you see on this diagram these little white kind of nodules, or these white kind of little, they almost look like rice bubbles kind of connected together. Okay, this is what's called a myelin sheath, and here's the kind of the close-up. So it's a layer. Myelin is this fatty sort of molecule kind of network that wraps around the axon like insulation around an electrical wire. The idea being that it protects it. It shields it from damage. It's maintained by these particular types of cells called a Schwann cell. So you can see that's kind of the nucleus of the Schwann cell that wraps itself around and creates and nourishes this myelin. And so that helps to keep it protected. But you notice how that there's all these little gaps between. Okay, and so that is, it's not a continuous kind of, so unlike electrical wire insulation where it's designed to be a continuous tube or continuous wrapping, that this actually deliberately has gaps between them. And it's actually, and these are called nodes of Ranvier. Okay, that they're each of these little gaps. And it's a little bit of a clumsy sort of name, especially if you can't pronounce French very well. But the idea being that these nodes are what is actually the most crucial part, because ultimately, we need to be able to send a signal along the axon. We're going to show you what that signal looks like in a second. But the idea is that we need these gaps in order to be able to pass the signal along. So if you imagine the signal traveling along an axon a bit like a line of dominoes, traveling and being knocked over at one end and it knocks the next one and the next one and the next one all the way through to the end, what it does is that by having these gaps, it means that we only need to pass it along to the next gap. So, or perhaps if you're like playing hot potato, you're kind of, a line of people passing things along. It's kind of like if you increase the gap between them, but they can throw it between them. And so then you can pass it along a greater distance much faster because you're bridging only small gaps. You're only passing it from hand to hand a small number of times. And so the idea is that these little gaps is where the signal kind of passes on and then it flicks onto the next one and the next one. So instead of traveling along this big, long, full line, it actually can skip through much faster. So it's a really speedy connection. Okay, so here we go. Here we've got a little GIF of an animation showing how the nerve impulse is able to actually travel along an axon. So a nerve impulse is an electrical signal that occurs inside the cell. Now, we're not really going to go through too much more specifically than this because you'd learn this, in biology in year 11 and 12 or even, university level science. But the idea is that you've kind of got the inside and outside of a cell where you get a certain flow of electrical charge that keeps swapping in and out. And what that does is that then that triggers the next bit, the next bit, the next bit. And it kind of, you can see that there's ripple of change that happens as we go from left to right. And so what we're recording is this little blip in our electrical signal of that impulse traveling from left to right and what you're seeing. Okay, and so what that does is that then that moves along the axon and then it gets to the other end and then it's able to pass on to wherever it needs to go. Okay, so it's an electrical signal, but it happens within the structure of the cell, which is why having those being able to pass that signal along quickly is really important. You don't want anything to slow this down. Okay, and we call this type of nerve impulse, or we call the signal an action potential. Okay, potential not as far as it's able to do something, but potential in terms of electrical kind of charge. Okay, so it's just some terminology there. All right, now we're going to think about how this signal can pass from one neuron to the next. So let's say we've got a signal, an action potential that's traveling along this cell, and it needs to then start to travel along this cell. Now the idea is that these cells don't actually physically connect together. They are very close together, but they are separate cells. There needs to be a gap between them. That gap between them is called the synapse. We're going to show you a close-up view of that in a second. But so the idea is that the signal travels along, gets to the axon terminal, and it needs to jump across to the dendrites of the next or receiving cell. And so we're going to show you how that connection is able to work. So this is a really close-up view of the synapse. So this is the end of an axon, so one of the axon terminals. Okay, and then this is the dendrite of the next neuron. But you can see that there's this little gap between them. It's a bit like the English Channel between England and France. Okay, or Bass Strait between the mainland Australia and Tasmania. But so the idea is that the signal travels through this axon and it needs to jump across to this other end, but they can't physically touch, or they aren't physically touching. And so what we need is a way to actually transmit the signal or pass the message along across the gap in a way that actually doesn't need a physical touching connection. And that's where we use, this synapse, the gaps between neurons, we use what we call neurotransmitters. So which is the little black dots in the diagram here that actually travel from the end of this neuron and then travel across the gap, and then they hit a little signal, kind of receivers on the other end, little receptors. So the idea is that each of these little, what we call synaptic vesicles, so it's just a little bubble inside that contains the neurotransmitters that are traveling towards the end. As they get to the end of the cell, then the vesicles open up and release their messengers into the gap, and then they drift their way across. They hit the right target on the other side, which triggers the next signal, and it keeps going. So the idea is that the neurotransmitter is able to bridge between the two things. So here's a couple of examples of some neurotransmitters that are really important in your body. The idea is that you need different neurotransmitters for different locations, different types of neurons, different functions, so exactly what kind of a signal they're designed to pass on. So ones like adrenaline, for example. Now, we'll talk about adrenaline again in the endocrine system as well, but it's also a neurotransmitter as far as it triggers the fight or flight kind of response. Other ones that are really relevant to you are dopamine and serotonin. So dopamine triggers feelings of pleasure inside your brain, and it's what gets triggered. These signals get triggered when you eat a food that you really like, or that or it also gets triggered when people take drugs. And so, like illicit drugs, and the idea is that this feeling is addictive, and you tend to chase it. So dopamine can be released for all sorts of pleasure activities, and the idea, whether it's shopping or eating or you name it. And so that feeling is then what your brain gets hooked on, and so then you keep chasing that feeling. Okay, serotonin is one that relates to your mood, and it's also one that becomes out of balance when in people have depression. Where it's actually a brain chemistry kind of thing rather than just a life event triggered thing. And so a disruption in the way that the body can process serotonin. And so that then what it does is that your level of serotonin changes, and then that causes different neurons to be firing to different degrees. Okay, acetylcholine is another one that's really important because it's really responsible for making muscles work, and there's connections between neurons and muscles. Acetylcholine is what's also really affected in things like pesticides or those sort of chemicals which are designed in insects to disrupt the effect of acetylcholine and stop those signals from being able to get through, and then they die. And then also anyone who's gone for a run, or anyone who's, those sorts of things that you get what's called endorphins, so that they give you that feeling of euphoria or that post kind of exercise high feeling. And they can also relieve pain and that sort of thing. Okay, so there are a couple of other ones here, but we're not going to go, this isn't a neurotransmitter course. So you can see that you have different ones for different jobs, that the chemical messenger, the structure is maybe similar or different depending on the kind of job it has to do. So just to recap, so we talked about the structure of the nervous system. We talked about the parts of the neuron and how their job is. We focused on the axon and how its structure allows signals to travel along really quickly. We showed you how a nerve impulse is able to travel along, called the action potential. We showed how neurons connect together across a gap called the synapse, and that the message is passed on because of the existence of neurotransmitters. All right, thanks very much for watching. Bye for now.